Good morning, Colonel. The judge's voice cut through the courtroom so cleanly that even the rustling papers seemed to freeze midair for a second. Nobody moved. Not the clerk. Not the attorneys. Not my daughter Clara sitting 3 rows behind me with her hands clenched tight in her lap. And definitely not my mother-in-law, Vivian Ashford, only moments earlier. She had been smiling. That calm, polished smile of someone who believed the outcome was already hers. But the instant Judge Malcolm Reeves called me Colonel, the color drained from her face like someone had pulled a switch. "What?" she whispered. Then louder. Colonel Y didn't move. I kept my hands folded on the worn brown folder in front of me. After 22 years in military courtrooms, I learned something most people never do. The loudest person in the room usually has the weakest case, and Vivian Ashford had been loud for months. Letters, accusations, threats wrapped in politeness. Now she stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Maybe she was. Because she hadn't dragged a helpless widower into court. She had picked a fight with the wrong man. 3 months before that courtroom went silent, I was standing alone in my kitchen, stirring a pot of beef stew Eleanor used to love. When the certified letter arrived, it was raining that afternoon in Annapolis. The kind of cold, steady rain that settles into your joints once you're past 60. I remember, because my hands were aching worse than usual. The envelope sat on the counter longer than it should have. Ashford, Pike and Rowe Legal Group. I didn't need to open it to know it wasn't going to bring anything good. Ever since Eleanor passed the previous winter, every interaction with her family had turned into something quiet and sharp. At first, it was small. Vivian correcting details at the funeral, saying the arrangements didn't reflect Ashford standards. Julian questioning why I handled the estate paperwork myself. Marianne offering sympathy that felt rehearsed. But grief doesn't stay polite for long, especially when money is involved. I opened the letter slowly while the stew simmered behind me, the smell filling a house that suddenly felt too large for one person. The words blurred at first. Petition for estate review. Allegation of undue influence. Property dispute. I sat down before I even realized I needed to. The cottage, that's what this was about. Not Eleanor, not loss, the cottage. It sat on a quiet stretch of Deep Creek Lake, where Eleanor and I had spent 34 summers together. It wasn't worth what the Ashfords were worth. It didn't carry their name, but it was the only place my wife had ever truly been free from them. Cancer changes everything. By the end, that cottage became the only place Eleanor could sleep without pain, pulling her awake every hour. She'd sit on the dock, wrapped in an old gray blanket, watching the water like it was the last honest thing left in the world. I'd sit beside her, keeping track of medications, adjusting pillows, learning the rhythm of her breathing in the dark. We didn't talk much toward the end. We didn't need to. Now her mother was claiming I manipulated her, that I isolated her, that I convinced a dying woman to leave me something that wasn't mine. I didn't laugh when I finished reading. Not this time. Because there's a point in life where betrayal stops surprising you and starts confirming what you already know about people. Quiet men get misunderstood, especially older ones. People see silence and assume weakness. They see a man who steps back and assume he has nothing left to stand on. I never corrected that assumption. After I retired, I didn't want to be known for what I used to do. I wanted mornings on the porch, coffee, repairs around the house, time with Eleanor, ordinary things, and for a while, I had them until Vivian Ashford decided I didn't deserve to keep what her daughter chose to leave me. That evening, Clara sat across from me at the kitchen table while the rain tapped softly against the windows. She looked tired. Divorce, 2 kids, hospital shifts. Life had worn her down in ways she tried not to show. "You should settle, Dad," she said quietly. "They have money, lawyers, connections. This could get ugly." I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the steam rise. "They say the cottage belongs to the Ashford family," I said. Clara didn't answer right away. "I was Eleanor's family," I added. That made her look up. Her eyes softened. "But the fear didn't leave." "I know," she said. "But they don't care about that." She was right. The Ashfords didn't care about love, or time, or the nights I stayed awake making sure Eleanor kept breathing. They cared about ownership, control, legacy. And they believed I was the weakest part of that equation. They believed I'd fold, sell, disappear, lose quietly. That was their first mistake. Their second was believing they understood who I was. A week after the letter arrived, Vivian invited the family to Sunday dinner. And that alone told me everything I needed to know. Vivian Ashford never hosted unless there was an audience. Her house overlooked the Severn River, all white columns and polished marble, the kind of place where silence felt expensive and nobody ever truly relaxed. The moment I stepped inside, I could feel it. This wasn't a dinner, it was a performance, and I had been cast as the cautionary tale. Julian barely acknowledged me, just a nod that stopped short of respect. Marianne gave me a tight smile, the kind people use when they want credit for civility without the effort of sincerity. Clara stayed close to me at first, but even she seemed unsure where to stand once the conversation started shifting. Dinner stretched on longer than necessary, filled with polite tones carrying sharp edges underneath. Vivian carved her roast with slow precision, then looked up like she was making a reasonable observation. "You must be feeling the strain financially now," she said. I took a sip of water before answering. "I'm managing." Julian let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Legal disputes can get expensive," he added, "especially when they're avoidable." I looked at him directly. "Some things aren't meant to be avoided." Vivian dabbed her lips with a napkin, watching me carefully. "The cottage was always intended to remain within the Ashford family," she said. "Eleanor understood that." I held her gaze. "Eleanor made her wishes very clear." "That's what you claim," she replied smoothly. The wording wasn't accidental. Claim, not fact. I realized then they truly believed I would panic, that I would fold under pressure, agree to a settlement, disappear quietly, and let them restore what they considered the proper order of things. Vivian leaned back slightly, studying me like she was deciding how far she could push. "You know what your problem is, Thomas?" she asked. I didn't respond. "You've always mistaken proximity for belonging," she continued. Marianne shifted in her seat, uncomfortable now, but not enough to intervene. Clara stared down at her plate. Julian watched with open curiosity, like this was a show he'd been waiting to see. Vivian's voice stayed calm, controlled, but there was something colder underneath it now. "Eleanor was an Ashford before she was ever your wife," she said. "That means something. Blood means something." I set my fork down slowly, not because I felt threatened, but because I understood exactly what she was doing. She wasn't arguing about property. She was rewriting history. "I was her husband," I said, "for 34 years, Vivian smiled. And this time it didn't even pretend to be kind. "Yes," she said. "You were." The pause that followed carried more weight than anything she could have said outright. Then she finished it. "But at the end of the day, Thomas, you were just her caretaker with a wedding ring." The room went completely still. Even the soft clink of silverware stopped. That was the moment that hurt. Not because of pride, but because it erased everything Eleanor and I had built together. The years, the quiet mornings, the nights in that cottage where nothing existed except the two of us and the sound of water against the dock. Caregiver. As if love could be reduced to a duty performed out of obligation. As if the last year of her life, the hardest year, defined everything that came before it. Clara inhaled sharply, but she didn't speak. She was still learning how to stand up to her mother's side of the family. I didn't blame her for that. Some people take longer to find their footing when they've spent years being told where they belong. I picked up my napkin, wiped my hands carefully, then placed it beside my plate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't give Vivian what she wanted, which was a reaction she could dismiss. I just looked at her. "I'll see you in court, Vivian." For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her expression. Not doubt. Not yet. Just a brief interruption in certainty. Then, it was gone. She smiled again. Softer this time. Almost pitying. "Thomas," she said quietly, "you won't make it past the first hearing." Julian leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Marianne looked relieved. The tension had found its conclusion. Clara looked like she wanted to say something, but didn't know where to begin. I stood, pushed my chair in, and walked toward the door without another word. Behind me, I could feel their confidence settling back into place, stronger than before. Because in their minds, nothing had changed. I was still the same quiet man who had married into their family. Still the same widower they believed they could pressure into submission. Still the same man they thought they understood. They were wrong about all of it, and they had just made that mistake in a room full of witnesses. That night, I sat alone on the back porch with the lights off, listening to distant thunder roll over the water. Annapolis always sounded different before a storm. Quieter. Like the air was holding its breath. I rested my elbows on my knees and stared out into the dark, thinking about Eleanor, about the last year of her life, about the way she used to sit beside me without saying anything, and somehow make the silence feel complete. Vivian's words replayed in my head, not because they surprised me, but because of how easily she said them. like everything we had built together could be reduced to a role she found convenient. Caretaker. I let the word sit there for a while, testing it, turning it over the way you examine something broken. Then, I exhaled slowly and leaned back in the chair. 22 years in military law had taught me something most people never learn. People don't just attack what you have, they attack what you are, especially when they think you won't defend it. The mistake Vivian made wasn't underestimating my finances or my patience. It was assuming I had forgotten how to fight. I stood up after a while and walked inside, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The hallway light flickered once before settling. I went to the closet I hadn't opened in months, maybe longer. The leather case sat exactly where I left it, pushed toward the back like something I had outgrown. For a moment, I just looked at it, then I pulled it down and set it on the bed. The clasps opened with a familiar, solid click. Inside, everything was still there. Military records, commission papers, case files I never fully unpacked, and resting on top, wrapped in a piece of dark cloth, the silver eagle insignia I hadn't touched since the day I retired. I picked it up and held it in my palm, feeling the weight of it settle into something deeper than memory. Not pride, not anger, recognition. I had spent years choosing not to be that man anymore. Eleanor had given me a reason to step away from it, to become something quieter, something ordinary. But standing there in that room, with the storm building outside and her absence filling every corner of the house, I understood something clearly for the first time since she died. I hadn't lost that part of myself. I had just set it aside, and now, I needed it back. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a small, steady breath, because I finally remembered exactly who I was. The morning of the hearing, I woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. That used to happen before major tribunals overseas, back when the stakes involved more than property and memory. Some habits never leave you. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark with a cup of black coffee warming my hands, watching the faint reflection of streetlights on wet pavement outside. Annapolis was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that feels earned after a lifetime of noise. I glanced at the folder beside my mug. Plain brown leather, no thick binders, no dramatic stacks of paperwork. Just enough. That was another thing military law taught me. The people most desperate to appear powerful usually carried the heaviest files. I dressed simply. Gray slacks, white shirt, navy tie, dark wool coat. Nothing that invited attention. I tied my watch strap tighter than necessary and looked at myself in the hallway mirror before leaving. A widower. A grandfather. A man most people would pass in a grocery store without a second thought. Good. The courthouse stood exactly the way old buildings like that always do. Cold stone, tall windows, security lines already forming near the entrance. I took the steps slowly, more out of habit than necessity, and halfway up, I heard Clara's voice behind me. "Dad," I turned as she hurried toward me, holding 2 coffees and wearing the same worried expression she had carried for weeks. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm here," I said. She exhaled like that answer helped more than it should have. "They're already inside," she added quietly. Of course they were. People like Vivian don't arrive late to what they believe will be a public victory. As we stepped into the lobby, I saw them immediately. Vivian stood near the security checkpoint in a cream-colored designer suit, pearls resting perfectly against her collarbone. Julian stood beside her in a tailored charcoal suit, arms crossed like he was attending a business negotiation instead of a family dispute, and, around them, 3 attorneys, polished, expensive, carrying thick binders filled with arguments they believed would end this quickly. Vivian noticed me first. Her smile appeared instantly, controlled and deliberate. "Thomas actually came," she said loudly enough for people nearby to hear. One of the attorneys glanced at me, then past me, scanning for legal counsel. When he realized I was alone, something in his posture shifted. Not surprise, assessment. "You don't have representation?" Julian asked. "I didn't say that," I replied, calmly. Vivian let out a soft laugh. "This isn't something you handle on your own," she said, stepping closer. Her perfume hit first. "Sharp and expensive. You should have accepted the settlement." I met her eyes evenly. "You should have respected your daughter's wishes." Something tightened in her expression. "There it is," she said quietly. "That arrogance." I shook my head once. "That's grief." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then the mask slipped back into place. "You're finished," she said. I didn't answer, because sometimes silence unsettles people more than any argument ever could. Inside the courtroom, everything felt smaller than I expected. Old wood benches, flags positioned with exact symmetry, The faint smell of paper and dust that never fully leaves rooms like that. I took my seat at the defense table alone, while Vivian's legal team spread their materials across the other side, like they were preparing for something far larger than a property dispute. I could feel people watching, not openly, but enough. An older man in the back gave me a look that carried quiet sympathy. He probably assumed I couldn't afford a lawyer. I didn't correct that assumption. Underestimation has its advantages. Clara placed a hand on my shoulder before sitting behind me. Last chance, she whispered. We can still settle. I looked straight ahead. Your mother didn't raise you to walk away from the truth, I said. Clara didn't respond, but I felt her hand tighten slightly before she let go. The hearing began exactly at 9. The bailiff announced the judge, and everyone stood as Judge Malcolm Reeves entered, carrying a thick case file beneath his arm. Late 60s, sharp posture, the kind of presence that comes from years of disciplined decision-making. He took his seat and scanned the room briefly before signaling for proceedings to begin. Vivian's lead attorney stood immediately, confident, composed, and well-rehearsed, Your Honor. This is an unfortunate but increasingly common case involving undue influence over a terminally ill individual, he began. I almost smiled. The narrative was predictable. A vulnerable woman, a manipulative spouse, a contested property. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, carefully constructing an image of me as someone dependent, opportunistic, emotionally controlling during Eleanor's final months. At one point, he described me as financially reliant on my wife. That detail didn't bother me as much as it probably should have. What did bother me was the suggestion that I isolated her, that I kept her from her family when she needed them most. Behind me, I felt Clara shift in her seat, anger tightening her posture. She knew the truth. Eleanor asked for quiet, not isolation. There's a difference most people don't understand unless they've watched someone they love fight to breathe. When the attorney finished, the room felt settled, like the conclusion had already been reached. All that remained was for me to react the way they expected, to stumble, to defend emotionally instead of precisely, to confirm the version of me they had just presented. Instead, I opened my folder and arranged my papers carefully. Judge Reeves finally looked toward me. Mr. Whitaker, he said, will you be representing yourself today? I nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. Across the room, I could feel Vivian's satisfaction settle into place again. In her mind, I had just confirmed exactly what she believed, that I was about to dismantle my own case. The judge studied me for a moment longer than necessary. Something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Recognition. Then, something else. Respect. The room grew quieter without anyone understanding why. Judge Reeves straightened slightly in his chair, and then he spoke. Good morning, Colonel. For a few seconds after the judge spoke, nobody in the courtroom moved. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels crowded, like every thought in the room suddenly stopped at once. Vivian's smile disappeared completely. Julian blinked like he hadn't heard correctly. One of the attorneys actually lowered his pen mid-note and just stared. Behind me, I heard Clara whisper. What I remained, seated, hands still resting on the folder, because I had learned a long time ago that the moment after a reveal matters more than the reveal itself. Judge Reeves held my gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, the kind reserved for professionals who recognize each other across time. It's been a while, he said. Yes, sir, I answered. Vivian leaned forward slightly, her voice tight. Colonel, she repeated. Like the word itself didn't belong in the same sentence as my name. The judge turned toward her with mild surprise. Yes, he said calmly. Retired Colonel Thomas Whitaker. The room shifted again, not physically, but in weight. You could feel it moving from one side to the other. For months, I had been the quiet widower being dragged through legal accusations. Now I was something else entirely. And nobody had prepared for that change, Judge Reeves continued. Matter of fact, Colonel Whitaker served over 2 decades in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. One of the younger attorneys cleared his throat. Your Honor, we were not aware Mr. Whitaker had legal experience. The judge didn't even look at him when he responded. That would be an understatement. A few people in the back shifted in their seats. The courtroom no longer felt like a place where the outcome was obvious. It felt like a place where something had just gone very wrong for one side. Clara's eyes were on me now. I could feel it without turning around, not confusion anymore. Something closer to disbelief. I hadn't told her everything, not because I didn't trust her, but because some parts of life don't belong in quiet years. After I retired, I made a decision. No stories, no titles, no explanations. I had spent enough time in rooms where people's futures depended on my words. I didn't want that version of myself to follow me home. I wanted to be Eleanor's husband. Later, I wanted to be her caregiver. And after she was gone, I wanted to be just another man learning how to live with the silence she left behind. Vivian stared at me like I had committed some kind of personal deception. "You were a lawyer?" she asked. I turned my head slightly toward her. "Yes. You told us you worked for the government," she said, her voice rising. "I did." Judge Reeves cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Ashford, please direct your comments through counsel." She leaned back in her chair. But the composure was gone now. The certainty had cracked. Across the table, the attorneys were adjusting, recalibrating, trying to understand what they were actually dealing with. The lead attorney stood again, though the confidence from earlier had thinned. "Your Honor, while Colonel Whitaker's background is certainly notable, it remains irrelevant to the matter of property ownership." That part was technically true. Rank doesn't win cases, evidence does. But credibility changes how evidence is received, and everyone in that room understood that now. Judge Reeves gave a slight nod. "Proceed," the attorney resumed. But his rhythm had changed. Before, he spoke like someone delivering a conclusion. Now he spoke like someone choosing each step carefully. Aware that the ground might not be as stable as it appeared, I waited until he finished his next point, then stood slowly. My knees protested slightly. "A reminder that time doesn't negotiate, Your Honor," I said. "May I respond directly?" "You may," the judge replied without hesitation. I turned toward the attorney, my voice steady. "You stated that I isolated my wife during her illness." "Yes." "Did you personally interview her oncology nurses?" He hesitated. "No." "Did you review hospice visitation records?" "No." "Did you speak with Dr. Shah regarding her treatment?" "No." I nodded once and returned to my seat. That was all. No argument, no raised voice, just absence. And, in courtrooms, absence can be louder than anything else, because suddenly, the narrative they had built began to show its gaps, and for the first time since this began, I watched doubt enter the room, not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to matter. Enough to change everything that came next. Court resumed after a short recess. But the atmosphere had changed in a way that didn't need to be explained. Earlier that morning, Vivian had sat like someone attending a ceremony already arranged in her favor. Now she sat stiffly. Shoulders tighter, eyes sharper, like she was trying to calculate something she hadn't planned for. Across the table, her attorneys were no longer relaxed. Their binders were still thick, their suits still expensive. But confidence had been replaced with caution. Judge Reeves adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the filings before looking toward me again. "Colonel Whitaker," he said, "you indicated you wished to respond further." I stood slowly, steadying myself with the table for just a moment. Not weakness. Just time reminding me where I stood. "Yes, Your Honor." I turned toward the opposing counsel. My voice, even. "You've constructed a narrative suggesting I isolated my wife during her illness." The attorney straightened slightly. "Yes." "Then, let's clarify something," I said. "Did you personally interview any of Eleanor's oncology nurses?" A pause. "No." "Did you review the hospice visitation logs documenting who was present during her final weeks?" Another pause. "No." "Did you consult with Dr. Shah regarding treatment recommendations and patient-requested restrictions?" He hesitated longer this time. "No." I nodded once. "Then, your narrative is based on assumption, not investigation." I returned to my seat. That was the first shift. Small, precise, but enough to make the courtroom lean forward instead of settling back, because once doubt enters a legal argument, it doesn't leave easily. Judge Reeves made a brief note, then gestured for me to proceed. I opened my folder, sliding one document forward. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit D." The bailiff collected the copies and distributed them. I watched the judge read, his expression neutral at first, then more focused. He adjusted his glasses, then read again. That was always a good sign. Across the room, the younger attorney scanned his copy quickly, then slowed down. His posture changed almost immediately. "Where did you obtain this?" the lead attorney asked. I looked at him. "From my wife." The document was simple. A notarized estate protection letter, signed 9 months before Eleanor's death. Clear language, direct intent. She stated the cottage belonged solely to me, not conditionally, not temporarily. Solely. And then the part that mattered most. "I am making this decision voluntarily, without coercion or undue influence." The words sat there in black ink. Unambiguous. Vivian's voice broke through the silence. That's not possible. I didn't raise my voice. No, I said. It's just inconvenient. That was the second shift, this time. It didn't just create doubt. It redirected it. Now, the question wasn't whether I manipulated Eleanor. It was whether Vivian was ignoring her daughter's clearly stated wishes. The courtroom began to see the difference. Judge Reeves placed the document down carefully. Proceed, he said. I opened the folder again. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit F. The bailiff passed the copies again, this time. The reaction came faster. The younger attorney's jaw tightened. The older one leaned closer, reading more slowly. This appears to be an email exchange, the judge said. Between the deceased and Mrs. Ashford. Yes, sir. He continued reading silently for several seconds, then looked up. Mrs. Ashford, did you pressure your daughter to alter her estate decisions during her illness? Vivian straightened immediately. Absolutely not. The answer came too quickly. Too clean. I had heard that tone before. People believe certainty makes a lie stronger. Usually. It just makes it easier to recognize. Page 3, Your Honor, I said calmly. The judge turned the page. The room went quiet again. Eleanor's words didn't need interpretation. Mother, if you bring up the cottage again, I will ask hospice staff to restrict your visits. Tom is here every day. You are not. Stop turning this into a transaction. Behind me. Clara covered her mouth. Julian looked away. Vivian's expression didn't soften. It hardened. That told me everything. The courtroom shifted again. Now the narrative was breaking apart. Not dramatically. Just enough for people to stop believing it automatically. The lead attorney requested a brief recess. Judge Reeves granted 5 minutes. The moment they stepped aside, Vivian's composure fractured. Her voice rose in sharp whispers. You told me those were deleted. Julian's voice came back, lower. You told us they didn't exist, the older attorney cut in, firm and controlled. You failed to disclose material evidence. There it was. The third shift. Not just doubt now. Fracture. Because once a legal team realizes their own client has withheld information, the entire foundation of their strategy begins to collapse. When court resumed, the tension had sharpened. No one was relaxed anymore. Not even the spectators. They could feel it. Judge Reeves looked toward me again. Do you have additional evidence? I paused briefly. Not for effect. For timing. Yes, Your Honor. I stood again and moved to the evidence table. Audio documentation, that got their attention. The older attorney closed his eyes for a moment. Just a second. But long enough to say everything. Vivian looked confused at first, then something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition. Fear. The bailiff connected the device. The room went completely still. Then her voice filled the courtroom. Cold. Controlled. Familiar. If Thomas really loved you, he'd sign the cottage back to the Ashford family before you die. Clara gasped softly behind me. The recording continued. You're not thinking clearly anymore. Eleanor. You're sick. And then Eleanor's voice. Weak. Tired. But unmistakable. Mother. Please stop. That was it. No argument. No explanation. Just a plea. The kind of sound you don't forget once you hear it. Judge Reeves raised his hand, stopping the recording. Nobody spoke. Vivian didn't move. For the first time since I had known her. She didn't look powerful. She looked exposed. The judge removed his glasses slowly. This court has serious concerns regarding potential coercive conduct, he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The meaning carried on its own. If further evidence supports these findings, criminal implications may follow. Across the table. The attorneys were no longer defending a position. They were managing damage, and in that moment, the case stopped being about property. It became about truth. And truth, once it finds its way into a room like that, doesn't leave quietly. By the fourth day of hearings, the courtroom no longer felt like the same place where this began. When I first walked in, people looked at me with quiet sympathy. The kind reserved for someone expected to lose. Now, they looked at me differently. Not with admiration, not exactly, but with recognition. The kind you give someone once you realize they understand the rules better than you assumed. The bailiff nodded to me each morning. Court staff addressed me with a tone that carried respect instead of dismissal. And Vivian Ashford no longer looked anyone directly in the eye. Her attorneys requested settlement again before proceedings began, this time with urgency that wasn't disguised as politeness. Your Honor, the lead attorney said carefully, my client would like to explore resolution options regarding the property. Judge Reeves looked toward me. Colonel Whitaker? I stood. No, Your Honor. Vivian turned sharply in her seat. What do you mean? No, I met her gaze, steady and unhurried. I mean your daughter already resolved this before she died. The room went still again. This wasn't about money anymore. It hadn't been for a while. Settlement would have ended the case quietly, but it also would have buried the truth under paperwork and signatures. And after months of being painted as something I wasn't, I needed that truth to stand on record, not for me, for Eleanor. Proceedings continued with final statements. Vivian's attorneys avoided confrontation now. They shifted to sympathy, framing her as a grieving mother overwhelmed by loss. Part of that was true. Grief does things to people. It distorts judgment. It magnifies fear, but grief does not excuse cruelty. And it does not justify rewriting someone else's life. Judge Reeves looked toward me. Colonel Whitaker, you may make your final statement. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of the room settle into silence. I didn't look at Vivian immediately. I looked at the judge, then at the polished wood floor between us, gathering the words I had carried for months without speaking. My wife spent the last year of her life in pain, I said. My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. Cancer takes things from people one piece at a time. Strength, sleep, independence. Behind me, I heard Clara's breathing shift. Quiet but unsteady. But it doesn't take clarity. I continued. Eleanor knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted quiet. She wanted dignity. She wanted to spend her last days somewhere that didn't feel like a negotiation. I finally looked toward Vivian. She wasn't staring at me anymore. Her eyes were down, fixed somewhere on the table in front of her. The cottage wasn't an investment, I said. It was the last place she felt like herself. I paused briefly, then said the truth I had held back since the beginning. I did not spend 34 years loving my wife just to take something from her when she became too weak to stand. The words settled into the room without resistance. No one moved. No one interrupted. Judge Reeves nodded once, then reviewed the documents in front of him for several seconds before speaking. This court finds substantial and credible evidence supporting the validity of the deceased's estate decisions. Vivian's shoulders dropped slightly, like something inside her had finally given way. The petition contesting ownership of the property is denied in full. Clara let out a quiet sob behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. Furthermore, the judge continued, this court notes credible indications of coercive conduct during periods of medical vulnerability. He paused, then looked directly at Vivian. While no criminal referral will be made at this time, let me be clear. The behavior presented in this case is deeply concerning. Vivian didn't respond, for the first time since I had known her. She had nothing to say. Ownership of the property remains solely with Colonel Thomas Whitaker. And just like that, it was over. No applause, no dramatic reaction, just the quiet finality of a decision that had been waiting to be spoken. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered near the steps, but I walked past them without slowing. Clara caught up to me near the bottom, her arms wrapping around me tightly. You won, she whispered. I shook my head slightly. No, I said. Your mother did. Across the plaza, Vivian stood alone near the curb. Her attorneys were already gone. Julian was nowhere in sight. For a moment, I considered leaving it that way, walking away, letting the outcome speak for itself. But something stopped me. I crossed the distance between us slowly. She looked up when I stopped beside her, her expression unfamiliar without the confidence she usually carried. You could report me, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. She hesitated, then asked the question I didn't expect. Why aren't you? I looked out toward the street for a moment before answering. Because after everything, I said. You've already lost the only thing that mattered. She didn't argue. She didn't deny it. She just stood there, silent, while I turned and walked away. 3 months after the court ruling, the cottage felt quiet again. Not empty. There's a difference. Empty feels like something has been taken from you. Quiet feels like something has finally been allowed to rest. I stood on the dock one October morning, with a cup of black coffee in my hands, watching fog drift slowly across Deep Creek Lake. The air carried that familiar mix of cold water and pine, the kind Eleanor used to say made everything feel honest. She loved mornings like that. Said the world behaved better before people woke up and started pretending. I stayed there longer than usual, not thinking about the case, not replaying anything that had happened in that courtroom. Just standing still and letting the silence exist without trying to fill it. That was new. Before, silence had weight. Now it felt like something closer to relief. After the trial, people started treating me differently. Neighbors who barely nodded before now stopped to talk. Old acquaintances sent messages that sounded like apologies without using the word. Even strangers recognized me occasionally, usually at the grocery store, where they'd glance twice before saying, "Colonel Whitaker." I never corrected them, but I didn't encourage it either. Titles have a way of changing how people look at you, and I had spent years trying to avoid that. I hadn't become stronger after the trial. That part people get wrong. I had just stopped hiding. Clara came out to the cottage almost every weekend with Owen. The first few visits felt careful, like she was still trying to understand where I fit in her life, now that she knew more about who I used to be. One afternoon, we sat on the porch while Owen played near the shoreline, throwing stones into the water with the kind of focus only children can maintain. "I think I understand now," Clara said quietly. I looked at her. "Understand what?" "Why you never talked about your work," she said. "Why you stayed so calm." I let out a small breath. "I wasn't always calm," I said. "I just learned when not to show it." She nodded slowly. Like that answered more than I had actually said. That's the thing about getting older. You realize people don't need the whole story, just enough to understand the shape of it. A few weeks later, my phone rang while I was repairing one of the dock boards Eleanor always said I'd fix next summer. I almost didn't answer when I saw the number. Vivian Ashford. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but age teaches you something about unfinished conversations. They don't disappear, they settle, and over time, they get heavier. "Hello," I said. There was a pause on the other end. "Thomas," she said, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "Could we talk?" We met at a small diner halfway between Annapolis and the lake. The kind of place with chipped mugs and waitresses who call everyone hon without thinking about it. Vivian arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a simple gray coat instead of the carefully chosen outfits she used to favor. For the first time, she looked like someone who didn't expect to be seen. We sat across from each other for a while before either of us spoke. Finally, she looked down at her coffee. "I was angry at Eleanor," she said. "I didn't interrupt. She chose you," Vivian continued. "Over this family, over everything I built." There it was. Not greed. Not entirely. Something deeper. Fear. The kind people don't recognize until it turns into control. "When she got sick," Vivian said, her voice tightening slightly, "I thought if I could manage things, the property, the estate, I wouldn't lose her completely." I watched her carefully. For the first time, I could see the difference between who she had been in that courtroom and who she was now. The anger was still there, but it wasn't leading anymore. "I loved her too," I said quietly. She nodded, eyes glistening, but not breaking. "I know that now," she said. That sentence mattered more than anything the judge had ruled. It didn't fix what she had done. It didn't erase the months she spent trying to tear apart something Eleanor had made clear, but it changed something. Not the past, just the weight of it. Winter came slowly that year. I spent more time at the cottage finishing the small things Eleanor used to remind me about. Fixing loose hinges, repainting the shutters, sorting through drawers filled with objects that didn't look important until you realized how often they had been used. One afternoon, Owen found an old photograph tucked inside a book. "Grandpa," he said, holding it up. "Is this you?" I walked over and looked. The picture showed me years ago in uniform, standing beside a courtroom podium. Posture straight, expression sharper than I remembered. "Yeah," I said, "that's me." He studied it for a moment. "You look serious." I let out a quiet laugh. "I was." He nodded like that made perfect sense, then asked, "Were you important?" I thought about that for a second. All the titles, the cases, the years that used to define me. Then, I shook my head slightly. "I was useful," I said. He seemed satisfied with that answer, maybe because it didn't try to be anything more than it needed to be. A few weeks before Christmas, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, from Judge Reeves. It wasn't long. Just a few lines acknowledging the case, the outcome, and the way it had been handled. At the bottom, he wrote something I read more than once. "Some men spend their lives chasing authority. Very few learn how to carry it quietly." I folded the letter and set it aside, then looked out toward the lake. He was right. That had always been the difference. Not power, not rank, just knowing when to use it and when to let it rest. Because peace without self-respect doesn't last. Eventually, it turns into something else. Something closer to surrender, and I wasn't willing to do that, not anymore. That Christmas Eve, I stood alone on the porch with the cold air settling deep into my chest, watching the lake reflect the moon in long, Quiet lines of silver. Inside, Clara and Owen were asleep. The house filled with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time since Eleanor died, the silence didn't hurt. It didn't echo. It held me steady, and I realized something then. This was never about revenge. It was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about protecting what we had from being rewritten by someone else's bitterness. Some people will always mistake quiet for weakness. They'll assume that, if you don't fight loudly, you won't fight at all. But they're usually wrong. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who's ever been underestimated, and tell me, who's the quiet person in your life that turned out to be stronger than anyone expected?